Those of you, in the meantime, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jemma Bailey. I'm the Executive Director at Indigo. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, the Awabakal and Worimi people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever you're joining us from this evening, we're all on Aboriginal lands and sovereignty was never ceded. I want to say a very, very heartfelt thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. There are many more people on this call than we anticipated, which is fantastic. We actually had to upgrade our Zoom account about an hour ago. And I know there are a number of committed long-term Indigo volunteers and supporters, as well as some newer faces that I haven't met yet. So I really welcome you all to this call and thank you for giving us your time. I invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself so that you can get a sense of who's on the call. I know that we're coming together this evening under a very heavy cloud. The news over the past 3 days is devastating. The immediate and long-term impacts are still unknown, and I know that Ali and Tamana have worked tirelessly this week, been on the phone for many hours day and night, and information is still being updated by the hour. We know there's a lot of fear and trauma in Afghanistan and also among the Afghan diaspora community in Australia. And as an organisation and as individuals, we stand in solidarity with those communities. And with that, I'll introduce our speakers. Firstly, Ali Reza, Yunespour, who many of you know. Ali arrived as a refugee in Australia as a teenager. He arrived with no English and a few years later was voted school captain at his high school in Western Sydney. Ali has a PhD from ANU on the Afghan higher education system and now works at Melbourne University. He's our partnership coordinator for our Afghan schools program, and he's been with us for more than a decade. And before that, his brother Salman was our partnership coordinator and worked with Indigo to get this program set up. As an organisation, we're indebted to Ali and before him to Salman for really driving the work that we do in Afghanistan. I also want to introduce Tamana. Tamana is Mirzada. Tamana is an Afghan-Australian youth advocate who's passionate about supporting newly arrived communities in their settlement journey. She arrived in Australia in 2007 from Germany. And in the past, Tamana has worked with organisations, including the Afghan Women Educational Centre in Kabul, and in Australia with the Lebanese Muslim Association, Community Migrant Resource Centre, and the Refugee Council of Australia. She works on building the capacity of refugee and migrant communities and supporting young people to develop their own solutions. In 2019, she was awarded the Refugee Council of Australia and START's Humanitarian Youth Award, and we're very lucky to count Tamana as one of our board members of Indigo at the moment. So the format for tonight is, given that we have so many people on this call, it will be less interactive than we'd first imagined. We've asked you to all stay on mute for the time being, actually for the entire call. And I'm going to start with a Q&A with Ali and Tamana on some key questions, and we'll then open up for broader questions, and I invite you to use the chat box to make comments and ask questions, and we'll draw from that. So I will get into it. Ali, first to you. Events in the past week have moved so rapidly. We're hearing mixed messages of quiet in the streets of Kabul, seeing those horrific images from Hamid Karzai Airport, and getting comparatively little information from the provinces. Ali, can you open by giving us a picture of what you think the political situation is currently at in Afghanistan, and what are the possible pathways in coming weeks and months?
Thank you, Jemma, and it's so good to see so many people and so many friends. So thank you for joining us tonight. It is very nice to see you all. Yeah, I begin with paying my respect to the elders as well. And it's of course a very challenging and tough time for every one of you, and of course for everyone in Indigo Foundation and our partner communities, and of course to the Afghan people, but I believe even to the entire world, because I think what we've seen in Afghanistan, I think just in the past 3 days, it is as big as 9/11 in terms of its significance for the world, and in my view, it will shape the history of the world, particularly I think the relationship of the Muslim world with the West and the international community, I think, for decades to come. We have got a group of radicals who have human rights abuses on their record, who have excluded girls from education for a long time. But they've got a message now to many young peoples around the world that they've defeated a superpower. And I think that narrative is quite strong, and it is very, so in that sense, a big event, and I think would have lots of geopolitical implications. What we see, I think, in Afghanistan now on the streets of Kabul and elsewhere, one thing that gives some hope is that at least in the shock of this event, there is a silence within the country. There hasn't been any major attacks or any major killing, for example, in the past 3-4 days, and everyone is in shock. Most people are still, for example, in capital Kabul or in their home. The Taliban have done some searches on house searching for people who have been government officials, civil society activists, but we don't have any, report of people being detained, and it is partly because I think the Taliban is trying to, push for their influence and power, but I think they're just careful, and it is partly because they're worried that if they go into what they did in the 90s, their government won't be recognized, and that lack of international recognition is what they lacked last time. So now they're saying that they're now a more experienced group, and they would like to work with regional countries. They would like to work with the international communities. So I think the weight of that pressure on the Taliban seems to give us some hope that there would be rather an inclusive government to be formed in Afghanistan, but what form and what shape would that take? As you know, there are lots of political and diplomatic conversation at the moment in Doha, in Pakistan, within the country, with former President Karzai, with Abdullah, who is the Chief of National Reconciliation. But yeah, all of that is at the moment on the air. No one knows. I can see that regional countries like China and Russia seem to show a stronger position in the past 2-3 days to recognize the Taliban, but they haven't, come and said that, yes, we do recognize you. But the Western countries are, in my view, in complete shock. Everyone is trying to evacuate as many people as they could, especially people who have worked with the Australian government, people who have worked with US, and as you know, 61 countries had some form of connection that they're evacuating this week someone from Afghanistan. So it is a huge, evacuation exercise, probably one of the biggest as far as I know. And so, and I think that will take time until probably 2-3 weeks, so that we don't know anything, perhaps by then, what would be the form of the government in the coming weeks. But in terms of Kabul itself, the Taliban did their first press conference last night in Kabul. What was also interesting is one of the representatives attended a private TV conference. He actually came and spoke and did an interview. And of course, the person who interviewed was an Afghan female journalist. So that was on Tilo TV, and it seemed that went well from the perspective of what we had seen from the Taliban before. So there are some changes. And of course, the language so far at the political level is very, in my view, very soft. And but in terms of what they do exactly and whether they would have the full control on their commanders at district, provinces, those are the things that are still, I think, emerging. We don't have the full picture of what is happening exactly on the districts and provincial levels. But in Kabul, things are calm. Everyone is in shock and disbelief. And of course, everyone is hoping that there will be a political settlement out of Doha in Pakistan in the next few days.
Thanks, Ali. To Tamana, I know as recently as last year, you're living and working in Kabul. and that you've been in very close contact with friends and colleagues in Afghanistan. So this is a two-part question. Firstly, what are you hearing that life is like right now for people in Kabul and in the provinces? And secondly, I suppose, what are your fears? We're seeing conflicting messages, as Ali said, some statements from the Taliban, for example, that girls will be able to continue going to school, but also stories from Herat, for example, where women are being sent home from work. So what are your fears, I suppose, especially for women and girls and for minorities in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Jemma. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I think it's very nice to see a great turnout, having more people to support myself and Ali. It's not an easy time, to be honest, to be in Afghan at the moment. And we are also working at the moment to support our families and friends in terms of evacuation as we're speaking. So yeah, so I really appreciate your presence here today. In terms of life in Kabul, so since Sunday, most of the news that the first news that came out after the first day they've captured the city is that it's very peaceful, it's very quiet. But that messaging in terms of peaceful and quietness, it means there's a lot of fear. People are in their home, they're scared. They don't want to leave their homes. People who have been previously targeted by the Taliban, including journalists, human rights defenders. There's a lot of shock within the community. A lot of young people feel very hopeless. I've been in touch with quite a bit of my networks in Afghanistan. Last year when I went to Kabul, I stayed there for 3 months before COVID-19. So I have a great network. In the messaging I'm hearing from most people, from my connections and my acquaintances, is people want to leave immediately. Given that there's historical evidence of prosecution, given that there's previously a lot of suicide bombings, there's public executions, the history of a regressive government is not welcomed by anyone. So that being said, you've seen the horrific images of people trying to evacuate. Those images of people at Kabul airport. So what happened is I was recently also told by some of my sources in Kabul that people were told you can go to the airport and you'll be allowed to go to Canada without a visa. And that news came within the same time frame when Canada announced that they will give 20,000 Afghans entry into Canada. That's also plays a significant contribution to why we saw so many people heading to the airport at that time also without, anything on their bags, and you've seen majority of them being men also, unaccompanied or by their own. On top of that, at the moment, a lot of journalists are being supported by people outside, obviously Afghanistan, because they can't. There's not much news being shared of what's happening in Kabul. It's only a few people. And as Ali mentioned, at the moment, we're not hearing much about what's happening in other provinces. Majority of the information coming through is centered around Kabul life. More recently, we had also an Afghan journalist on the 17th of August. He interviewed the Taliban. And the Taliban are now in charge of the checkpoints in Kabul. So he was interviewing the Taliban, walking with them, talking very casually, and you could see the fear in people around them. The Taliban, in the interview, for example, the Taliban would greet civilians, obviously very fearful, but obviously acknowledging and greeting back. So there is a lot of hostility at the moment, I would say. And for people, especially like I mentioned, who have historical prosecution, who have previously been genocide because of the Taliban, including minority groups such as Sikhs, Hazaras, people of Shia religious background. It's very tough at the moment. The main issue right now is there's not many options, to be honest. That's how many people are feeling at this point. And they're hoping that the international community will do something to support them.
Thanks, Tamana. For the new people who have joined, because of the number of people on the call, we're just asking everyone to stay on mute, but we invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself, and any comments and questions, which we'll pick up in a little bit. Ali, I want to go to our work in Afghanistan. I know in the questions section we'll come back to the current situation throughout Afghanistan. But for those on the call who are newer to Indigo, we've been working in Ghazni province for 18 years, since 2003. And over that time, we've partnered with the local community to build 8 schools, including the region's first girls' school, and provided infrastructure across a further 23 schools. We've also trained teachers and supported female teachers as part of that program. So, Ali, firstly, can you share an overview of our current work and the status of those activities? And secondly, I know that people on the call are going to want to know what you think that work might look like going forward. I know, for example, in Ghazni City, has been under Taliban control for the last 3 weeks. So what is life like? What do you think are the implications for the schools that we work in?
Thank you, Jemma. And I think that's very, important question, because, I know that, everyone who is here tonight have, trusted Indigo and our partners, and of course myself on a personal level. So this question, if you allow me, I would give some, lengthier response to it. As late as last Thursday, when I was speaking with community, the student had their mid-year exams. Schools were open last Thursday, and it was, running all as normal. And as you know, that everything changed, from around, Friday last week, and then of course Saturday, Sunday, when we saw the collapse of the government. So in terms of the schools that have been closed now, is partly because since the Taliban have come into control in the past 3 days, schools in most part of the country are still closed. But they did come and say to people that you can still send your kids to schools and universities, as Jemma was saying. For example, in Ghazni province, there is Ghazni City, which fell to the Taliban last week, but around Ghazni City, there is a huge, little towns which are dominated by the Hazaras. And those part of Ghazni City actually fell to the Taliban about 4 weeks ago. And what the Taliban did in the past 4 weeks to those communities is they actually said to those community, leaders and elders that you could still send your kids to schools. And so as far as I know, until last week, before Ghazni's fall, when I was, closely watching what's going to happen under the Taliban, people were still sending their kids, especially at primary and secondary level, to schools. This is around Ghazni City. And of course, the schools were open in Bojigai and Jirgai and Besud. They had their mid-year exams. And then, so that's in other words, one of the things that we have seen, an indication that perhaps the Taliban are facing a new Afghan society. And the other thing which I think is important, which came to, in my mind, I think when I was watching with the unfolding events in Afghanistan, and when we look at the history of Afghanistan for the past, 4 decades, since the start of the war, this was probably the first time where Kabul regime changed with little bloodshed, very little bloodshed in that sense. And in my view, I think why that happened was because the overall public view was that this is a wrong war and we should not have this fighting. Whether you're on the side of the Taliban or the side of the Republic, this was a wrong war, and they were saying, let's stop this. And this was a constant conversations that I had before the collapse of Kabul, during the collapse of Kabul, and since then. And people were saying this is a wrong war, it should have stopped for a long time. And I think why people have come to that view is we are talking about a country where nearly 65% of its population is below the age of 25. And most of them have only seen Kabul and education in the past 2 decades. And when we talk about those 30 million of Afghans, I mean, as late as last week, for example, when government were in control, there were about 7 million children still in schools. There were about 400,000 students in private higher education institutions. So the schools that we have supported, in my view, have made a particular contribution on two levels, I think. One is on an individual level, and the individual contribution is, of course, and I've said this, that if a kid, whether a girl or a boy, has gone to school for even a day, let alone a year or 10 years or 5 years, no one can get the education from them. I think that's really important. I mean, Taliban could suppress them. Taliban could tell them, you don't go to school. But these kids, their education will remain with them, and someday that foundation will help them to do something else. And I think the fact that, you know, people did not fight this time, it was a clear indication that we are in a society where the general public awareness about the role of education, the role of public institutions, the role of government is very strong. And I think that is on the individual level. And of course, on the collective level, we are working with a country and a society where it is as global as any other country in that sense. In other words, we've got young people who are connected with social media. We've got young people who are connected with mobile phones, with internet. I mean, the level of awareness in the regime change that just happened this time in Kabul, I don't think so even Australians have got engaged with any other regime change with Afghanistan to the extent that we are engaged this time. And it's partly because we're, you know, responding to public pressure from a more educated young people. And the other thing that I think really surprised me with this transition that I look, which actually gives me a lot of hope, and that is that I think the political elites in Kabul, when they fell off and they left the country, I think the clear message that they got is you can't run a country with corruption forever and then ask your people to come and defend you against what, you know, the so-called your enemy, and you continue to educate them. And I think the fact that a lot of young people did not stand with the government was partly because of recognition at the society level that what is the government is doing is as wrong as to some of the things that we are seeing in the Taliban controlled areas. So I think that public social, I think the social pressure on the elites, partly driven by their education and of course partly driven by their desire for peace and calm and stability, have been really the reasons that we saw this really immediate collapse. And I think for that reason, when I've been reflecting in the past 3-4 weeks, and particularly I think in the past 3-4 days, as much as I'm disappointed with what is happening in Afghanistan, I'm still very hopeful as well. And I think that is really an important one. Yes, we have political uncertainty. Yes, we would have people who would be leaving the country. Yes, we've got, you know, chaos probably in parts of the country. But as long as we get, I think this is why it becomes really important that as long as we get a political settlement that would be inclusive, I think the society is ready to continue with what they had. And this is a clear message that I'm hearing from community leaders, that we're talking with community representatives, with the school principals, teachers, and of course, everyone in Bojagai, Jirgai, and basic community telling us that it is important that we continue with what we've started. It could just be in different format, with different textbook, perhaps with the different things. But I think it's important to see, I think that part of this, terrible and really, chaotic situation that we're hearing outside from Kabul as well.
Thanks, Ali. It's such a rare kind of message of potential hope in the midst of the last few days. Tamana, I want to turn back to Australia now. For Indigo, this work is not just a partnership in Afghanistan, it's been a partnership with the Afghan community in Australia as well. And we know there's a huge amount of collective grief within that community right now. There are still 4,000 Afghan nationals who are on temporary protection visas, and calls to urgently expand our humanitarian intake. Can you share how your community is faring right now and what you're calling on the government to do?
Thank you, Gemma. Yeah, definitely. I think, first of all, obviously we're still also in shock, but at the same time, I don't think you could say there's time to grieve or even process what's happening, because all of us at the moment are trying to find some information to assist those in terms of evacuating, in terms of providing access to information. trying to find some support, but also get our government also to respond immediately. We still, only today we heard that they promised an intake for 3,000 people, which obviously is not enough, to be honest, given that there's a lot of human rights defenders, women, people with a disability, people who are marginalized, who are very vulnerable, and also people who have commented before, spoke against the Taliban. So it's really difficult, for us at the moment in terms of working and advocating with the government to make sure that there's a mutual understanding between what is happening on the ground, and also what support can be provided. While at the same time, for a lot of people, it's been a traumatic experience. Mental health has been exacerbated further. On top of that, with the lockdown, for many people who have been in New South Wales, Victoria, with last 2 months in lockdown, there's not much options in terms of also vocally expressing how we're feeling. So there's no options to even, for instance, organize a protest. There's a lot of other Afghan diaspora communities across the globe. That's one of the responses, for example, at the moment. While at the same time, to be honest, it feels like there's not too many options in terms of available for Afghans at the moment who are in Afghanistan, but there's a lot of things we can do here in Australia in terms of our response. So what we're seeing in terms of the global rhetoric and options, most countries and also diasporas is obviously immediate evacuation, securing Kabul International Airport, whilst at the same time assisting those who are in our communities on temporary protection visas, offer them permanent protection, and also speed up the process for family reunion. And at the same time, obviously long-term is looking at the reduction of violence and assisting also Afghans who are currently in Afghanistan who don't have even access to the news, don't have access to information in terms of living a dignified life. And there's over 400,000 people who are currently displaced since January. A lot of them are in need of urgent aid in terms of emergency shelter, food, cash assistance. The banks have recently obviously run out of money. That's what we're hearing in Afghanistan. They've closed. So, and the news was that today they're opening up again. So it's important that aid continues to those who are most vulnerable and that it gets delivered. And as I mentioned, there's heavy focus on evacuation. And one of the challenges we're also foreseeing is that once many more people get evacuated, and obviously these people who get evacuated are very highly skilled, have experienced Afghan locals working for NGOs representing specific government organizations across different countries. There's going to be also, Afghanistan's going to be facing quite a bit of a brain drain in terms of skills from locals. There will be less people available on the ground, providing that support, but we're hopeful that the international community such as IRC, UN, are staying committed to ensuring that aid will be delivered the next few weeks.
Got one last question before I hand over to Lila, who's going to help pull together some of those questions. I know a lot of questions are coming through in the chat box, but before we do that, this is a final question to both Tamana and Ali, and it's, what message would you send to the Australian government at this time when things are looking so challenging, and what practical steps can we as individuals take? What would you recommend, or what are you calling for to stand by the people of Afghanistan and safeguard the rights of women and girls? Either Tamana or Ali, who wants to go first?
Tamana, you go first.
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, in terms of measures, in terms of action, what we can take, there's a lot of different methods at the moment that it's been undertaken by the Afghan diaspora community. And that would look into, for example, foremost, it's very important to inform our local and politicians about what's happening and how we're feeling, and also supporting our fellow, Afghan community members. I myself, I'm an Afghan myself, and for me, the last couple of days, it's been very nice to see the solidarity in terms of people reaching out to the local MPs and also sharing and voicing our opinions. And that can be done through numerous ways. At the moment, for instance, which we will also share with you shortly, is a automated campaign happening where you just put your contact details, you put in your postcode, and it will automatically send a letter to your MP, and the letter has been already pre-filled by fellow Afghan diaspora advocates. While at the same time, obviously donations are very important in terms of, as I mentioned before, there's a great need of aid, especially for those people who have been newly displaced. As I mentioned, there's 400,000 who have been newly displaced, and recently, as you have seen from the news, also in Kabul, Shoranau Park, so the city park, hosted quite a few families. We're not seeing at the moment any updates in terms of what kind of support has been provided, because obviously a lot of the media attention has shifted. It's important to keep supporting them and not alienating them at the moment. And as earlier mentioned as well, Indigo Foundation is launching an appeal for that. So it would be very important, and we urge you to provide support who have been newly displaced as well. And overall, yeah, trying to understand, also allowing Afghan voices to be heard and be part of this discussion, listening to our concerns in terms of how our local community is affected, helping us in terms of raising awareness, as I mentioned, sharing those automated email campaigns with your networks, with people you know, people who you think would also be supportive of being an ally for the Afghan community. And at the same time, I think if you have Afghan friends, co-workers, neighbors, it would be nice to check on your fellow Afghan friends, neighbors, share some solidarity, especially this time. So yeah, there's a few things. Ali, do you want to add anything?
My point here is that I think my main message to the Australian government, and I think to the international community, is that we should not abandon Afghanistan. I think by abandoning Afghanistan, this humanitarian crisis will further and deepen, in my view. It is a country of 4 decades of war. We've got, millions of people internally displaced. The level of poverty is, in my view, at the highest level. I mean, we're talking about 70 million people below the poverty line. And, it's a very difficult situation. So I think abandoning Afghanistan is not the solution. And what should happen, I think, is now the international community should use it as leverage and it is influence on countries of the region, and of course, through the UN mechanism, to make sure that the Taliban, we know that they will come to power, but they come to power at in a way that, perhaps there is room for education, there is room for women's rights, there is room for, human rights. And yes, it might not be, a complete democracy in my view, but at least some form of representative government, for example, that people would have, opportunities for participation. So that, in my view, is one. And the second thing is, of course, it is a time that humanitarian assistance is the most needed in Afghanistan, and that's why the political, chaos that have been created in Kabul now, that should have been resolved as quickly, because one of the barrier now humanitarian agencies now face in Afghanistan is they cannot deliver aid to Afghanistan because Taliban is still at the UN, on the UN sanction list. Because they're on the UN sanction list, the humanitarian assistance cannot go in Afghanistan. So that's why this political, transitions that they're talking in Doha, it is very important that that should be resolved very quickly, because otherwise the people of Afghanistan continue to suffer in Afghanistan. And if, would you allow me, I think there was a good question, I think, here about how quickly the government fell and why. I think it is true to say that before this, scenes of government loss of control that we saw, there were the Asia Foundation survey, which was running every year. At nowhere, the support for the Taliban was up to 15% nationally. It was very low, even when the government, was corrupt, even that things were chaotic. But I think what it actually shows, as I said, it actually shows two things. One is that people were tired of the political elites on all sides, whether it was government, Taliban, and everyone. They just wanted to an end to this violence. And that's why I think people did not resist the Taliban, because, they thought that, instead of destroying everything, let them come in and hopefully there will be a political solution. The second thing that I think it will show, as I said earlier, is that we've got an increased number of young people who are willing to have a peaceful life. They don't want violence, and I think that's important to be celebrated, given that what is happening. So my view is that yes, the Taliban perhaps has not changed. It is hard probably to trust on their words. We don't know how things will play out, but I think the international community in Australia, including, have a very good leverage here to play out on what is happening in Afghanistan. Of course, what else we want, and I think that's more relevant for here, is, we want Australian government to give permanent residency for people who have been here for more than, 10 years. We want a speed processing of family reunion visa, and of course, continued support for Afghanistan. And on that level, I might, I should say a very big thank you to everyone, I think, in Australia for what you've done in the past few days. You've supported the Afghan community who are here on every way you could have done it. We have reports of a school, for example, a school teachers supporting Afghan kids. We've got families calling us to say, are we okay or not? We've got, hundreds of activists calling for refugee rights, for women's rights in Australia. And the level of support that we have seen in Australia in the past few days, it has been unprecedented for the Afghan community here and for Afghanistan. We have not seen a similar thing in the US, and I think that is a very hopeful sign. And so I should thank everyone here, and I think more broadly to the Australian community. We are very encouraged by the support that we have seen.
Thanks, Ali. And I'll share in the chat a couple of those links that Tamana mentioned as well from the Australian Afghan community. I want to open up now for questions, and I'm going to invite Lila, our Indigo Foundation chair, to help with that, because I haven't had my eyes on the chat. There's obviously quite a lot in there, so I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we can take some of them on notice. Lila, I'll hand over to you.
I'm going to take, we've got limited time, so I'm going to try and collapse the questions a little bit on your behalf, if that's okay. And I apologise in advance for not doing them justice. The first one I'll direct to Ali. There's a couple of questions that relate, I think, more specifically to our projects. What are the community elders saying on the ground? That's coming from Pat Duggan and from Cressida Hall. Both of these people have had a long-term involvement with Indigo. What support are we offering to people who have worked and helped us to build the schools in the communities that we've supported? Just briefly.
Yeah, the first question, as I said, I think as you know, I've been talking with the community. The community everyone is in the mood of wait and see. That's the way we could describe it, because as I said, until Thursday last week, the schools had midterm exams, and this is a few days now that the students have not been into school. So the community, in my view, even have not had a chance to even think about what they want. But the message that I've been hearing, at least, is that they don't want to stop their education. They continue to, send their kids to, schools. But what form that will take, as I said, because politically things are uncertain, especially in Kabul, the local people on the ground, it is hard for them to make any decision yet.
Thanks, Ali. And also a specific question from Jude Finch. What do you think will happen specifically with the Hazara people under the new regime?
This one is, again, I think, a hard question to answer at the moment, because, as I said, the Taliban have been sending mixed messages in different areas. For example, in Kabul, we have seen that they had a press conference yesterday. At the press conference, we had some female journalists They attended an interview with Tulu TV, which is the mostly, private TV, the most prominent private TV in Afghanistan. And the representative spoke with a, female journalist. The female journalist from Tulu TV, for example, had a report herself of the street of Kabul yesterday as well. And of course, as I said, in Ghazni and elsewhere, the Taliban have allowed people to commemorate the Ashura, which is the, celebration of Muharram, which is very important for the Hazaras. These are very early days. People are, as I said, even in Kabul, for example, as I spoke this morning, people still had their, some of those mosques open in the Shia-dominated areas. What would happen in the next few weeks or months as the Taliban consolidate their power, we don't know. And again, I think all of that would depend on the nature of this new political settlement. If the Taliban succeed and the rest of the political elite succeed to form, a relatively inclusive government in the next few weeks or months in Kabul, I think that will set a tone for some positive steps, I think, in the right direction. I think this is why it is important that this is not about one school, this is not about a community. The crisis that is in Afghanistan is beyond individuals and beyond one particular community.
I'm conscious of time at this point, so I'm going to collapse a number of questions which are perhaps most clearly expressed in can a leopard change its spots? There's a number of questions that relate to whether we can trust the Taliban in relation to the health and education for women and girls. And I'll look to Tamana to make a brief comment on that and concern about how that might go forward.
Thank you. Like Ali mentioned, there's a lot of mixed messaging. And yesterday, the Taliban even had a press conference where they keep reiterating, oh, things will have changed now. You will support the women and girls. But as we mentioned before, we're hearing different stories across provinces. We're hearing different stories of how women have been treated the last few weeks as well, by the Taliban specifically. To be honest, the last 20 years, we know the relationship and the history between the Taliban and women and girls in terms of access to education specifically. And, the rhetoric is also a lot of female activists. That's one of the key messages when they are advocating for women equality across Afghanistan. They speak highly against the Taliban. Like the key message is that, like from my perspective, that they still have the same firm kind of position. And everything we're seeing is a bit of, like Ali mentioned, they're just trying to, maybe gain some legitimacy across other international actors, and there's just another thing we have to notice that foreign forces haven't officially left. There's evacuation happening as we're speaking. So I'm very concerned once, foreign forces have left Afghanistan, specifically, who are carrying out evacuations as we speak, what the situation would look like then. But I would, for this comment, and if someone asks, have things changed, I would ask them, reflect what happened 20 years ago? How were women and girls treated? And do you think it will be the same or not now? Reflect on what has happened and look at the history in terms of having a repressive government in Afghanistan.
Thanks, Tamana. Perhaps I'm going to take this last question and just because I think it's helping me with my stress levels about finishing. Is there a chance for a further Zoom in a couple of weeks? And I think we'll take that idea on notice because this is it's really frustrating to draw this to a close, but I am going to try and do that. There's also a question there about how people can contribute. Indigo Foundation will launch an appeal tomorrow, so please look out for that. We're very grateful to people who've supported us in the past, but we want to raise some funds that can help us respond in the immediate context with both practical support in Afghanistan for the people that we work with, but also here in Australia. So I want to just very quickly firstly acknowledge and this speaks to Ali Rafet's words to us. Thank you, Ali. That we acknowledge the uncertainty and insecurity and fear that is being faced in the provinces and in Kabul right now. And our hearts go out to everyone that we've worked with and to the communities more broadly. I want to say from my side and from Indigo, we'll do everything in our power and resources in the coming days and months to support first the safety of people on the ground that we're connected to, and also to look at ways that we can respond. And as Ali and Jemma have mentioned, it's going to take us a little while to get that information about the needs and the most practical way we can support those needs. I want to also acknowledge the trauma and stress being faced in our diaspora community in Australia, and Tamana and Ali are very much a part of that. Their grief and sadness, despite their hopeful messages today, this week has been palpable. And Indigo will also be seeking to work with the diaspora community, both in advocacy and in providing practical support where we can in Australia and Afghanistan. I was too heartened with the messages of hope that came from Ali and Tamana. I'm also heartened by the resilience that we've seen in Afghan people, in our communities, and in Afghan women in particular. I've read and seen some amazing things coming out of Afghanistan. I want to say thanks to Ali and Tamana in what has been an horrific week for you, to your families. It's been a difficult time. You've had sleepless nights, and you're still working with us really, really closely. We totally value having you as part of Indigo Foundation, and we'll be there for you and the people you care about. I want to thank all our supporters, many of whom are on this call, and we have for our Afghanistan education program some very long-term supporters who are committed to our work, and I hope the message that you take away is that work will be there for the long haul. We have to switch gear a little bit right now in responding to the crisis, but we will find ways to continue, even if we have to adapt those ways into the future. I want to thank Jemma, Ali and Tamana and some board members for putting tonight together. We'll look at doing another one. And I wanted just to touch on the 4 things that we're immediately focusing on organisationally. Our board met on Sunday, Ali briefed us then. That is supporting the immediate safety of the people that we've worked closely with in Afghanistan, reassessing the logistics of how we can provide support and get money into Kabul and into our communities. Working with the diaspora community in Australia, as I said, and other NGOs. We're now connected with ACFID, and we had a great meeting with a wide range of NGOs this morning, where we heard, we focused particularly on the evacuation of people and securing the safety of Afghans, but that's very important. And advocacy to the Australian government, and some of the messages there, without going into too much detail, around the potential humanitarian crisis that we're likely to face in the very short term, or Afghanistan is likely to face. The critical role that civil society and NGOs have to play in both Afghanistan and Australia in this space. Australia's withdrawn its embassy. We heard this morning that it's looking at trying to have a regional presence. But in the meantime, local organisations and organisations like ours are really trying to do the best we can to get support in. And the other area is around the Australian government using this moment as an opportunity to shift direction on family reunion, on granting permanency to those on temporary protection visas, and increasing the humanitarian refugee intake. And as Tamana and Ali commented, making that as easy as possible, not making it really, really difficult, i.e. apply for visas. So thanks to everyone for participating. That's a really short summary of where our focus is right now. Indigo will be really hoping that you'll continue to remain interested and support us in the work that we have ahead of us. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll come back to those questions we missed, either by way of some information or in our next discussion. So apologies to those we didn't get to. Thank you so much. And thanks to Mana and Ali again. It's been appreciated.
And on a personal level, thanks everyone. I think it means a lot to myself and Tamana, and as I said, to the entire community. Our focus is, of course, on Afghanistan. It is why, because, as I said, the level of humanitarian need is very big. And, you know, one thing that I could confidently say from my life, we have lived all of our life in some form of conflict. I think the way forward is still in Afghanistan is to educate more people. So I'm grateful for that. I'm very thankful for all of you. Yes, we will have bumpy roads ahead. Will be times that we will hold this process, but I'm still hopeful. I think what education can do, even limited education. So thanks everyone. We will continue to, provide update in the next few weeks and months, as Leila said. So yeah, very, very grateful for your support for many, many years.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks so much, everyone. Stay connected with us. Look out for the appeal launch tomorrow, and we really, really appreciate your interest and your support. Thank you so much.